A Vietnamese communist soldier watched an American throw away a half-eaten apple and realized everything he'd been taught was a lie. Nguyen Van Thuan had spent 3 years fighting a nation his commanders described as poor and collapsing. But when the Americans captured him, they made one fatal mistake. They let him see the truth. November 17th, 1967. Cu Chi District, South Vietnam. Nguyen Van Thuan pressed his face into the mud of the tunnel as American voices echoed above, certain that capture meant the torture and execution his political officers had described in vivid detail for 3 years. What he could not know was that his capture would trigger not death, but the most profound disorientation of his life, a journey to a nation that, according to everything he had been taught, could not possibly exist. Within 6 months, Nguyen would stand in an American supermarket, paralyzed by abundance his village had never imagined. He would watch housewives discard more food in minutes than his family ate in months. And he would realize everything he had been taught was a lie. The tunnel network beneath Cu Chi had been Nguyen's home for 18 months. At 22 years old, he had spent more time underground than above it since joining the National Liberation Front in 1965. His political officer, Tran Minh Duc, had spent countless hours in the darkness describing the enemy above. Americans were racist killers who massacred civilians without thought. Their nation was a collapsing empire, racked by poverty and racial violence, held together only by military oppression of the working class. The soldiers hunting them were desperate conscripts from America's slums, poorly trained and equipped, fighting for a government on the verge of economic collapse. The grenades and tear gas that flooded the tunnel system on that November morning contradicted none of this. Nguyen expected brutality. What he got was a canteen of water and a medic who treated the shrapnel wounds in his leg with more care than his own unit's medical officer had ever shown. The American soldiers who pulled him from the tunnel spoke in calm voices. They photographed him, recorded his name and unit, and transported him to a field hospital where a doctor spent 40 minutes removing metal fragments and suturing the wounds with precision Nguyen had never witnessed. The processing center at Long Binh contained 3,000 captured Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers. Nguyen spent 6 days there, observing with growing confusion. Every prisoner received 3 meals daily. The food exceeded what he had eaten as a soldier fighting for liberation: rice, meat, canned vegetables, fruit. The medical tent treated hundreds of prisoners daily for wounds, infections, and diseases. Antibiotics, pain medication, surgical procedures. None of the promised torture materialized. On November 23rd, Nguyen and 47 other prisoners were loaded onto a C-130 transport aircraft at Tan Son Nhut Air Base. The American officer in charge explained their destination. High-value prisoners with intelligence information were being transported to the continental United States for interrogation and detention. The Geneva Conventions would be observed. They would be treated humanely. Nguyen had never flown before. Few people in his village had ever seen an airplane up close. The aircraft's 4 turboprop engines generated over 18,000 horsepower. What he understood was the smooth, powerful ascent and the casual efficiency with which American crew members managed the flight. Le Van Khai, a tunnel fighter from Nguyen's unit, sat beside him during the flight. At 19 years old, Le had never traveled beyond Tay Ninh province. His entire world had existed within 50 kilometers of his birth village. The American crew members moved through the aircraft with practiced ease, checking equipment, distributing food and water, monitoring the wounded. One sergeant, a black man whose presence contradicted everything they had been told about American racial segregation, handed out blankets and positioned himself to answer questions in broken Vietnamese. The in-flight meal shocked both men into silence. Plastic trays containing sandwiches with thick slices of meat and cheese, fruit cups, cookies, and cartons of milk. The American soldiers around them ate identical meals without comment, some discarding half-eaten sandwiches into trash bags. Le Van Khai watched an American private throw away a perfectly good apple after one bite. In Vietnam, that apple would have been a luxury item. Here, it was garbage. Tran Minh Duc, the former political officer who had lectured Nguyen on American depravity, sat 3 rows back. His silence during the flight spoke volumes. Everything he had taught was meeting its first contradictions. The Americans treated prisoners with casual indifference rather than cruelty. The soldiers displayed no signs of poverty and desperation. The aircraft itself represented technological sophistication that exceeded anything in the North Vietnamese arsenal. The flight crossed the Pacific over 3 days with refueling stops at Clark Air Base in the Philippines and Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. At each stop, the prisoners observed through windows. The Philippine base sprawled across thousands of acres, its runways handling dozens of aircraft simultaneously. The Hawaii stop revealed well-maintained buildings and American military families living in comfortable housing with automobiles parked outside. Nguyen used the flight time to reassess everything he thought he knew. The propaganda had been specific. America was on the verge of economic collapse, its people starving while the military-industrial complex consumed the nation's wealth. Yet the aircraft carrying them represented engineering sophistication beyond anything he had encountered. The wounded soldiers were being transported home to receive medical care in hospitals that operated at standards unimaginable in Vietnam. American soldiers played cards, read magazines, listened to portable radios, and discussed their plans after returning home. One specialist from Ohio described the car he planned to buy with his saved pay, a 1968 Ford Mustang. Another talked about returning to college on the GI Bill. The casual assumption of prosperity permeated their conversations. These were not desperate men from a collapsing empire. The aircraft descended toward Travis Air Force Base in California on November 26, 1967. Through the window, Nguyen saw his first glimpse of America. The San Francisco Bay Area spread below like a vast circuit board of lights and structures. Highways crisscrossed the landscape, packed with thousands of automobiles even at night. Suburban neighborhoods stretched to the horizon, each house with electric lights burning. The entire landscape blazed with illumination, a constellation of electricity that made Saigon look like a village by comparison. The pilot announced their descent. Through the window, Nguyen counted more automobiles in a single parking lot than existed in all of North Vietnam. The aircraft touched down smoothly, and the cargo door opened to reveal an America that contradicted 3 years of political education. The journey from certainty to confusion had taken 72 hours. The journey to complete ideological collapse would take 3 years. The prison compound at Fort Lewis, Washington, looked nothing like a prison. Nguyen Van Thuan stood behind the chain-link fence on December 1, 1967, watching American soldiers drive their personal automobiles into the parking lot. Not military vehicles, but private cars, one for each soldier. In his village of 400 families, there had been exactly one truck, owned collectively and used only for emergencies. Here, enlisted men drove to work in their own vehicles. The compound designated for Vietnamese prisoners sat on the eastern edge of the base, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Guard towers overlooked the compound at each corner. By any measure, this was a detention facility, yet the conditions inside contradicted everything Nguyen had been taught. Each barracks contained rows of beds with mattresses, pillows, and wool blankets. Electric heaters warmed the interior against the Washington winter. Flush toilets and hot showers occupied one end of each building. Fluorescent lights illuminated every space. The first meal arrived at 1800 hours on their first evening. Cafeteria-style service in a heated dining hall. The prisoners lined up with metal trays, moving past American cooks who served portions of food that defied comprehension. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, bread with butter, fruit cocktail and milk, coffee and sugar available in unlimited quantities. Le Van Kai filled his tray and sat beside Nguyen, staring at the food. In 3 years with the National Liberation Front, he had never seen this much meat in one place. The chicken leg on his plate weighed more than his typical daily rice ration. He ate slowly, reverently, expecting someone to snatch the tray away. No one did. When he finished, a guard indicated he could return for seconds if desired. Tran Minh Duc sat alone at a corner table. His tray remained untouched for 10 minutes as he studied the food and the Americans serving it. His entire ideological framework had been constructed on the premise of American poverty and Vietnamese moral superiority through sacrifice. The meal before him represented more resources than his unit had possessed in a month. He began eating mechanically, his face expressionless, his eyes distant. The medical facility occupied a separate building near the compound entrance. On December 4th, all 48 prisoners underwent comprehensive physical examinations. 3 American military doctors and 6 medics conducted the examinations with professional thoroughness. They tested vision and hearing, took blood samples, performed X-rays of old injuries, treated infections, and prescribed medications. Nguyen's leg wounds from the tunnel extraction received fresh dressing and antibiotic ointment. The doctor explained that the shrapnel had been completely removed and the wounds were healing properly. He prescribed a 10-day course of penicillin to prevent infection. In North Vietnam's medical system, such attention was reserved for high-ranking party officials. Here, it was provided to enemy prisoners. The dental examination revealed conditions common among rural Vietnamese. The American dentist began a program of treatment that would span months. Fillings, extractions, cleanings, all performed with modern equipment and anesthesia. Le Van Khai, who had suffered from an abscessed molar for 6 months, received emergency extraction and pain medication. The relief was immediate and profound. Winter in Washington state introduced the prisoners to climate-control technology. Temperatures dropped below freezing in December. The barracks remained comfortably warm, heated by electric systems that maintained consistent temperature. Hot water flowed from shower heads 24 hours a day. Electric lights burned continuously, making night indistinguishable from day, but the prisoners had been warned by Vietnamese intelligence officers before deployment. American prisoner camps were designed to break minds, not bodies. Comfort was a weapon. Abundance was psychological warfare. The more the Americans gave, the more suspicious the prisoners became. This luxury, they told each other in whispered Vietnamese after lights out, was surely a prelude to interrogation. Real torture was coming. It had to be. The waste shocked them more than the abundance. American military operations at Fort Lewis generated mountains of garbage daily. The prisoners observed as trucks hauled away trash containers filled with discarded items that still functioned perfectly. Wooden pallets used once and thrown away. Cardboard boxes opened and discarded. In one memorable incident, Le Van Khai watched American soldiers discard an entire pallet of canned goods because the cases had been damaged in shipping. The cans themselves were intact. The Americans threw them away without hesitation. Television appeared in the compound recreation room on December 15th, a single black and white set tuned to American channels under guard supervision. News programs showed anti-war protesters in American cities, thousands of citizens openly criticizing their government's Vietnam policy. Commentators debated the war's merits without fear of arrest. Advertisements hawked consumer products with abundance that seemed fantastical. Automobiles, household appliances, food products, all marketed to ordinary citizens. The commercials fascinated Nguyen more than the news. American companies spent fortunes advertising products to common people. Breakfast cereals, soft drinks, laundry detergents, toys for children. The advertisements assumed American families possessed refrigerators, stoves, washing machines, automobiles, televisions, and telephones. One commercial advertised a vacuum cleaner designed to make housework easier. The existence of such a device implied American homes had both carpets to clean and electricity to power machines for cleaning them. Tran Minh Duc watched the television in silence. As a political officer, he had taught that American media was pure propaganda, controlled by capitalist overlords to deceive the masses. Yet here was American media openly criticizing the government, showing dissent without consequence, and revealing a standard of living that made Vietnamese prosperity look like destitution. Nguyen watched Tran's hands shake as he gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles white. Beyond the fence lay the portion of Fort Lewis where American military families lived. Rows of houses, each with cars, bicycles, gardens, and Christmas decorations as December progressed. Children played in yards after school, well-fed and warmly dressed. Women drove automobiles to commissaries for shopping. The normalcy of it contradicted the propaganda image of American domestic chaos and poverty. The Christmas season brought decorations to the base, electric lights strung on buildings and trees. On December 25th, the prisoners received a special meal that exceeded even the daily abundance. Turkey, ham, dressing, cranberry sauce, vegetables, pies, ice cream. American church groups from Tacoma, sent gift packages containing toiletries, candy, and handmade cards. Local Boy Scout troops delivered Christmas greetings in carefully practiced Vietnamese. The kindness devastated the prisoners more thoroughly than cruelty could have. These Americans knew they were enemy soldiers. Many had sons or husbands fighting in Vietnam, yet they showed Christian charity to men who had been trying to kill Americans months earlier. After the Christmas meal, Tran Minh Duc returned to his bunk and wept quietly. Other prisoners heard him but said nothing. Everything they had believed was proving false. The guard rotation changed on January 2, 1968. The new officer in charge, Major Robert Holland, announced expansion of the prisoner program. Selected detainees would begin work assignments off base, supervised labor that would take them into American communities. Those who participated would receive small payment and the opportunity to observe American life beyond the fence. Every prisoner volunteered. Work offered distraction and the possibility of answers. If the abundance within Fort Lewis was propaganda theater, surely the world beyond the fence would reveal truth. Nguyen signed up for agricultural work. Le Van Khai requested assignment to maintenance crews. Tran Minh Duc was assigned to a civilian employer who needed warehouse labor. The morning of January 8, 1968, Nguyen Van Thuan climbed into the back of an army truck with 11 other prisoners and 4 armed guards. They drove through the gates of Fort Lewis and entered America. What he saw would destroy the last fragments of his ideological certainty. The supermarket in Tacoma, Washington, stretched before Nguyen Van Thuan like a cathedral of impossible plenty. Under armed guard but allowed to observe during a lunch break, he watched American housewives push metal carts through aisles containing more food than his entire district had seen during the Harvest Festival. One woman, annoyed that her preferred brand of coffee was out of stock, left her full cart and walked out. The guard smiled at Nguyen's expression. First time in a grocery store? Nguyen could not speak. If you're finding this story as fascinating as we are, hit that subscribe button. We're uncovering hidden Cold War histories that challenge everything you thought you knew about that era. Drop a comment below telling us what surprises you most so far. The work assignment had brought Nguyen to a farm 30 miles south of Tacoma. The farm covered 800 acres, more land than Nguyen's entire home village possessed combined. Growing hay, corn, and vegetables for regional markets, the owner, Eric Johansson, employed the prisoner work crews during winter months for equipment maintenance and field preparation. The pay, 80 cents per hour, went into accounts the prisoners could access. The real payment was exposure to American agricultural reality. Johansson's farm operated with mechanization that made Vietnamese agriculture look Paleolithic. 2 John Deere tractors could plow the entire 800 acres in less than a week, work that would take 300 Vietnamese farmers an entire planting season. A combine harvester cut, threshed, and cleaned grain at rates that would have required 300 Vietnamese laborers working by hand. Irrigation systems delivered water automatically. The entire operation employed exactly 4 people. In Vietnam, a farm this size would have required 300 families. The Johansson family lived in a 2-story farmhouse with indoor plumbing, central heating, and electricity throughout. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with electric stove and refrigerator, a living room with television. 2 automobiles sat in the driveway. The youngest son drove his own car to high school. The family ate meat daily and discarded food waste that would have fed Vietnamese families for weeks. During lunch breaks, Johansson's wife Helen often brought food to the workers: sandwiches with thick slices of roast beef or ham, potato chips, cookies, and thermoses of hot coffee. She served the Vietnamese prisoners identical portions to what her family ate. Her kindness was casual, unremarkable, extended without thought. The absence of ideology in her generosity made it more powerful than any propaganda. Nguyen worked alongside an American hired hand named Terry Morrison. Terry drove a 1965 Chevrolet Impala that he had purchased, used for $1,200, roughly equivalent to 15 months of his farm wages. The car featured a V-engine, automatic transmission, radio, and heater. Terry considered it mediocre transportation until he could afford something better. In Vietnam, such a car would have been reserved for the highest party officials. Here, a farm laborer owned one and complained about its defects. One afternoon, while repairing a fence, Terry Morrison asked Nguyen about farming in Vietnam. Nguyen explained the water buffalo, the hand tools, the entire village working harvest. Terry listened, then gestured at the tractors. Man, I'd go crazy doing it by hand. How do you feed everyone? Nguyen paused. We don't, he said quietly. We don't. The lunch break trips to town revealed American consumer culture in full display. The Safeway supermarket occupied 15,000 square feet, its aisles stocked with thousands of products. 50 varieties of breakfast cereal. 30 types of bread. Fresh meat counters displaying beef, pork, chicken, and fish in quantities that exceeded monthly consumption for entire Vietnamese villages. Produce sections offering fruits and vegetables from across the continent. Canned goods stacked floor to ceiling. The prices shocked Nguyen as much as the abundance. A pound of ground beef cost 79 cents, less than 1 hour of his prisoner wages. A loaf of bread cost 25 cents. A gallon of milk cost 95 cents. The average American worker, earning $2.65 per hour, could purchase a week's groceries with 1 day's wages. Lavan Kai's assignment to base maintenance took him through residential neighborhoods surrounding Fort Lewis. Houses ranging from 1,000 to 2,000 square feet sat on quarter-acre lots, each with lawn, driveway, and garage. Every house had electricity, running water, sewage systems, telephone service, and mail delivery. Most had television antennas. Many had swimming pools. The neighborhood's median home price was $22,000, achievable for families earning the median income of $8,000 annually. The garbage trucks fascinated Le more than anything else. Every Thursday morning, municipal trucks drove through neighborhoods collecting trash from bins placed curbside. Le watched American families discard furniture that still functioned, appliances that could be repaired, clothing that remained wearable. On one Thursday morning, Lavan Kai watched a family throw away a television. Not broken, replaced. The father was upgrading to a color set. Lei asked the guard if he could have it. The guard laughed, against regulations, but tell you what, he pointed to 3 more TVs in the trash pile down the street. Every week, same thing. This neighborhood alone throws away more working electronics than exist in all of Hanoi. The trucks compacted thousands of pounds of waste daily, hauling it to landfills where American abundance was buried in the earth. Schools visible from work sites revealed another dimension of American investment. Yellow buses transported children to large buildings with playgrounds, sports fields, and parking lots for teachers' cars. Education was free, mandatory, and universal. The buildings themselves exceeded the quality of universities in North Vietnam. Tran Minh Duc's warehouse assignment placed him in direct contact with American consumer economics. The warehouse distributed household goods to retailers across western Washington. Tran spent his days loading trucks with televisions, refrigerators, washing machines, and hundreds of other appliances. The warehouse inventory represented more consumer goods than existed in all of North Vietnam. The goods flowed continuously. The warehouse manager, a veteran who had served in Korea, treated Tran with professional courtesy. He explained the distribution system, how manufacturers in dozens of states produced goods that moved through logistics networks to reach consumers within days. A single appliance store in Tacoma sold more refrigerators monthly than were manufactured in Vietnam annually. The evening returns to Fort Lewis forced the prisoners to confront what they had witnessed. They gathered in the recreation room, ostensibly to watch television but actually to process their cognitive dissonance. Some still insisted it was theater, an elaborate deception. Others quietly acknowledged the truth. America was not collapsing. America was the wealthiest, most powerful nation in human history. February brought rain to Washington state and deeper depression to the prisoners. The work continued, exposing them daily to abundance they could not explain within their ideological framework. They saw American workers protesting for higher wages while earning more in a week than Vietnamese workers earned in a year. They saw waste that could feed nations and casualness that revealed security. Nguyen kept a secret diary, February 15, 1968. Today I watched an American throw away a perfectly good pair of boots because they were scuffed. I have worn the same sandals for 3 years, held together with wire. The American's discarded boots would last me a lifetime. He tossed them in the garbage without thought. This is not propaganda. This is reality. We cannot defeat these people. They have too much of everything. The Tet Offensive began on January 30th, 1968, while the prisoners worked in American communities. Nguyen Van Thuan was repairing a barn roof in Tacoma when he heard. He climbed down, asked the guard to return to base immediately. He needed to see. By evening, all 48 prisoners crowded around the television. They watched American news anchors describe attacks in Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, cities they knew. Streets they had walked, friends they had fought beside. The offensive was massive, coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. The prisoners felt pride surge through them. This was it, the great push. Victory. Then the camera showed American response. Within 12 hours, reinforcements were airborne. Equipment was flowing. The logistical machine the prisoners had witnessed in Washington state was simply scaling up. They watched cargo planes land at Tan Son Nhut, the same base where their journey to America had begun, watched supplies being unloaded in quantities that made the offensive look like a pebble thrown at a mountain. Le Van Khai did the mathematics in his head. The ammunition, the medical supplies, the food, the equipment, all flowing into Vietnam in response to Tet, exceeded the entire stockpile of the North Vietnamese army. In 48 hours, the Americans had moved more material than his side had accumulated in 4 years. "We're dying for nothing," he whispered in Vietnamese. Nguyen heard him, said nothing. But he knew Lê was right. The American response to Tet demonstrated the industrial capacity the prisoners had observed firsthand. Within days, reinforcements flowed to Vietnam. Equipment replaced losses. The logistics system that supplied bases like Fort Lewis simply scaled up operations. The prisoners watched American productivity respond to crisis with the same casual efficiency they saw in supermarkets and factories. March brought spring to Washington and deeper transformation to the prisoners' understanding. Tran Minh Duc requested a meeting with Major Holland. How was such abundance possible? The American economic system was supposed to be exploitative and unstable. Workers were supposed to be oppressed. Yet he had seen workers owning cars and homes, abundance distributed widely, and stability that persisted despite protest and dissent. Major Holland's answer was simple. Freedom creates prosperity. When people are free to work, innovate, own property, and keep the fruits of their labor, they produce more than any controlled economy can achieve. American capitalism delivered inequality through shared abundance. The conversation destroyed Tran's remaining ideological foundation. He had spent years teaching that capitalism was theft, that prosperity required exploitation. He had seen the opposite. American workers lived better than Vietnamese party officials. The prosperity was real, sustainable, and based on principles that Vietnamese communism rejected. He requested books on economics, American history, and political philosophy. Major Holland provided them without hesitation. If this Cold War revelation is blowing your mind, make sure you share this video with someone who needs to see it, and drop a comment about what aspect of this story you find most compelling. Your engagement helps us bring more hidden histories to light. The re-education classroom at Fort Lewis contained no torture equipment, no interrogators, no threats. Instead, American military instructors offered English lessons, civics courses, and vocational training, voluntary, not mandatory. Nguyen Van Thuan sat in a chair designed for comfort, holding a pencil and paper provided free of charge, listening to a former Vietnamese professor, a refugee who had fled the North, explain how American democracy functioned. Outside the window, American families walked their dogs in the evening. Inside, the foundations of Nguyen's worldview crumbled one lecture at a time. The English classes began in April with basic vocabulary and grammar. Nguyen attended reluctantly. Learning the enemy's language felt like collaboration. Several prisoners refused entirely, sitting in their bunks during class time, maintaining ideological purity through silence. But Nguyen was practical. If he was going to be here for years, he might as well understand his captors. 20 prisoners attended the first session. The instructor, Sergeant Michael Chen, whose family had immigrated from Taiwan in 1952, taught with patience and humor. The prisoners progressed rapidly, motivated by the utility of English. Within a month, Nguyen was reading American newspapers. Within 2, he was arguing with the prisoners who had refused classes, trying to explain what he was learning. Within 3, they were attending too. By June, All 20 prisoners who had initially refused were sitting in Sergeant Chen's classroom taking notes. By June, advanced students were reading American newspapers and magazines. Time, Newsweek, Life, publications filled with photographs and articles about American society. The magazines revealed a nation grappling with profound challenges. Civil rights struggles, anti-war protests, urban riots, political assassinations. The coverage was critical, often brutally so. American media did not hide problems. They investigated, criticized, and demanded accountability. This transparency shocked the prisoners more than the abundance had. In Vietnam, media served the party. Criticism was treason, yet American journalists exposed corruption, challenged policy, and questioned authority, and the system protected this dissent as a constitutional right. The civics courses explained American political structure, separation of powers, federalism, constitutional limits on government power, regular elections with universal suffrage. The system was complex, often inefficient, and designed to prevent concentration of authority. Professor Nguyen Thanh Hai, the refugee instructor hired to teach civics, had fled North Vietnam in 1954 during the partition. He had watched the land reforms, the political purges, and the systematic destruction of intellectual freedom. He spoke to the prisoners with lived experience. Professor Hai described North Vietnam before 1954, when it had been poor but hopeful. He described the communist takeover and the purges that followed. Between 100,000 and 450,000 people killed in land reforms, intellectuals imprisoned or executed. The promised prosperity never materialized. Instead, scarcity became policy. He contrasted this with American prosperity. The difference, he argued, was freedom. Free markets created abundance. Free thought created innovation. Free speech created accountability. Political freedom allowed peaceful change. Vietnamese communism concentrated power and abolished rights. The results spoke for themselves. Tran Minh Duc attended every lecture, taking notes, asking questions that revealed his internal struggle. He had been a political officer who taught communist ideology with conviction. His questions became increasingly sophisticated. If capitalism was exploitation, why were American workers prosperous? If democracy was chaos, why was America stable? Professor Hai answered with patience and evidence. He showed economic statistics. Median income in America versus Vietnam, productivity per worker, consumer goods production. Every measure showed American superiority, not because Americans were inherently better people, but because their system incentivized productivity and protected innovation. Television access expanded in May. The prisoners watched American news coverage of the 1968 presidential campaign, Lyndon Johnson's withdrawal, Robert Kennedy's assassination, the Chicago Democratic Convention riots. The coverage was uncensored, showing American democracy at its messiest. One evening in June, the prisoners watched coverage of the Apollo program. NASA announced plans for a manned moon landing within a year. The Saturn V rocket required 7.6 million pounds of thrust to escape Earth's gravity. The entire program cost over $25 billion, a sum larger than Vietnam's entire gross domestic product. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface on July 20, 1969, the prisoners at Fort Lewis watched on television and understood they had been fighting a nation capable of sending men to the moon while simultaneously fighting a war on Earth. Nguyen Van Thuan watched the moon landing in silence, tears running down his face. His nation, armed with rifles and rice, was fighting an empire that could reach the moon. The asymmetry defied comprehension. America was operating on a different technological level, a different economic scale. The war was not a conflict between equals. That night, for the first time since capture, a prisoner attempted to defect. Tran Minh Duc approached Major Holland's office at 0200 hours, requesting asylum. He could not return to Vietnam carrying this knowledge. He could not face his family, his comrades, his country, knowing they were dying for a system that guaranteed poverty while fighting a nation that had created abundance through the very freedoms Vietnam called evil. Major Holland's response devastated him more than rejection. "I understand," the major said, "but the Paris Accords will require repatriation of all prisoners. you'll have to go home. But what you've learned goes with you. Maybe that matters more than you staying here. Tran returned to his bunk and burned his diary, 13 notebooks documenting his ideological collapse. If he had to return, he would return silent. But silence, he was learning, could be its own form of testimony. Mail from Vietnam arrived irregularly through international Red Cross channels. The letters described conditions that confirmed everything the prisoners had learned: food shortages in the north, rationing of basic goods, lack of electricity in rural areas. The gap between what their families described and what the prisoners observed daily made the cognitive dissonance unbearable. Nguyen received a letter from his mother in October 1969. She described the rice harvest, smaller than the previous year. She mentioned his younger brother's illness, untreatable without medicines. He wrote back carefully. He assured her he was well. He did not mention the abundance, the electricity, the medical care, or the waste. She would not have believed him. Nguyen spent 3 days composing his reply. Every sentence was a minefield. He couldn't describe the abundance. Censors would remove it, or his mother would think him mad. He couldn't explain his transformation. Political officers would interrogate him. He couldn't share truth. There was no vocabulary for it that would survive the journey. His final letter was 15 sentences. I am well. I am fed adequately. I am treated according to international law. The climate is cold. I think of home. I miss you. Tell my brother I hope he recovers. The Americans are not as we were told, but I cannot explain here. When I return, we will speak. Until then, know I am alive and thinking of you all. Your son, Nguyen. He sealed the envelope knowing every word would be read by American censors first, then Vietnamese censors, then maybe, his mother. The truth he wanted to share would die in bureaucracy. Knowledge without transmission is just private madness. He was wealthy with information and poor in ways to share it. That night, Nguyen Van Thuan sat in his bunk and wept quietly. The knowledge they possessed was a burden. They had seen truth that could not be shared, witnessed prosperity that could not be described. They were prisoners of knowledge that had no outlet. Tran Minh Duc's transformation was the most complete and the most catastrophic. As a political officer, he had taught classes on dialectical materialism, the inevitability of communist victory, and the scientific superiority of Marxist economics. He had seen believers executed for insufficient ideological purity. He had reported fellow soldiers for defeatist talk. His entire identity was built on communist certainty. America destroyed that identity brick by brick. First came doubt, maybe propaganda exaggerated. Then came questions. Why can workers own cars? Then came calculations. The mathematics of American production made Vietnamese statistics look like lies. Finally came horror. If this was wrong, everything was wrong. Everyone he'd reported had died for his mistakes. The purity he'd enforced was based on lies. He was not a guardian of truth. He was a murderer for fiction. The breakdown came on a Tuesday evening in March. During dinner, Tran stood up, walked to the center of the dining hall, and began speaking in English. I taught you were evil, he said to the American guards. I taught you were dying. I taught you were weak. I sent men to kill you believing this. I was wrong. I am a criminal. I murdered truth. Major Holland rushed over, tried to calm him. Tran pulled away. Don't you understand? I have to go back there. I have to return to Vietnam and teach the same lies, or they will execute me. I cannot unlearn what I've seen. You've broken my mind by showing me reality. This is torture more complete than any beating. They sedated him that night. The camp psychiatrist diagnosed severe adjustment disorder with psychotic features. In layman's terms, reality had shattered his identity, and his mind couldn't construct a new one fast enough. When he recovered 3 weeks later, Tran was quieter. He attended classes, worked his shifts, and kept a low profile. But at night, Nguyen could hear him crying in his bunk. Tears for the men he'd condemned, tears for the certainty he'd lost, tears for a future where he would have to live a lie or die for truth. The Americans had not laid a hand on him. They'd simply shown him the world as it was, and that had broken him more thoroughly than any interrogation could have. By autumn 1969, 2 years after capture, the prisoners had achieved substantial English proficiency and comprehensive understanding of American society. The cumulative effect was complete ideological transformation for most. They remained Vietnamese, but they no longer believed communist propaganda about American evil or capitalist collapse. The question that haunted them was simple: what now? They knew the war was lost, not on battlefields but in economic reality. They knew Vietnam could never match American production. They knew their ideology was built on lies, but they also knew they were going home. Some prisoners, like Tran Minh Duc, couldn't reconcile the contradiction. He stopped eating in early 1972, a quiet protest against being sent back to defend a system he knew was false. The camp psychiatrist intervened. Major Holland spent hours convincing him that survival mattered more than ideology, that he could do more good alive in Vietnam than dead in Washington. Others, like Nguyen, made peace differently. He would return. He would keep silent. He would farm. But he would remember. And if Vietnam ever asked for truth, he would be ready to speak it. The knowledge couldn't die just because it couldn't yet be spoken. By the time the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973, the prisoners were ready. Not eager, ready. They would carry invisible cargo home, seeds of truth planted in minds that propaganda could no longer reach. March 1973, Travis Air Force Base, California. Nguyen Van Thuan stood in line with 47 other Vietnamese prisoners, waiting to board the transport plane that would return them to a liberated North Vietnam. Each man carried a small bag of personal items. But the real cargo they carried was invisible: the knowledge of what they had witnessed, memories that could never be erased, and the certainty that their homeland's victory would be built on ruins while their enemy's defeat would barely slow its prosperity. The airplane's engines roared to life. Nguyen took one last look at America, the land that had defeated him not with bullets, but with abundance. The Paris Peace Accords, signed on January 27, 1973, ended direct American military involvement in Vietnam. The agreement included provisions for prisoner exchange. The prisoners at Fort Lewis received the news with mixed emotions: joy at going home, fear about what awaited them, and despair at leaving the abundance they had witnessed for the poverty they knew waited. The final weeks at Fort Lewis passed in preparation and reflection. The prisoners packed their possessions. They said goodbye to Americans who had guarded them, taught them, and employed them. Some exchanged addresses, though both sides understood the futility. Major Holland called each prisoner for an individual exit interview. He asked about their treatment, whether they had complaints, if they felt the Geneva Conventions had been observed. Every prisoner confirmed humane treatment. Nguyen's interview lasted 30 minutes. Major Holland had supervised the compound for 3 years and knew each prisoner individually. He asked Nguyen about his plans after repatriation: return to his village, resume farming, hope for peace. Major Holland nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. Nguyen had no real plans because the future was unknowable. Major Holland leaned back in his chair, studying Nguyen's face. What will you tell your comrades about America? Nguyen chose his words carefully. That we were treated according to Geneva Conventions. That we were not tortured. And the rest? The supermarkets, the farms, the waste, the abundance? They would not believe me, sir. Why not? Because I did not believe it myself until I saw it. Words cannot carry this truth, only eyes. The flight to Hanoi departed Travis Air Force Base on March 15, 1973. The aircraft would cross the Pacific with refueling stops in Hawaii and the Philippines before landing at Gia Lam Airport in Hanoi. Tran Minh Duc sat beside Nguyen during the flight. 5 years earlier, he had been a political officer lecturing soldiers on communist superiority and American depravity. Now he was a broken man returning to a homeland he no longer believed in. He had requested asylum in the United States, a request denied on grounds that all prisoners covered by the Paris Accords must be repatriated. As they crossed the Pacific, Nguyen reflected on the transformation 5 years had wrought. He had arrived certain of American evil and Vietnamese righteousness. He departed certain only of human complexity and ideological bankruptcy. The Americans had not tortured him into changing his beliefs. They had simply let him observe. Le Van Kai spent the flight reading an English-language book on agricultural mechanics, a gift from Eric Johansen. The book explained modern farming techniques that could revolutionize Vietnamese agriculture if Vietnam possessed the machinery, capital, and freedom to implement them. The book was both a gift and a torment. The landing at GLM Airport occurred at dawn on March 18, 1973. Through the aircraft windows, Nguyen saw Hanoi. The city looked smaller than he remembered, grayer, poorer. The airport facilities were primitive compared to American bases. No paved parking lots filled with automobiles. No electric lights illuminating every space. Just concrete runways and simple buildings. The North Vietnamese reception committee waited on the tarmac. Military officers, party officials, medical personnel, and political officers charged with evaluating the returnees. The prisoners disembarked into humid tropical air. The sensory contrast hit like a physical blow. Fort Lewis had smelled like fresh paint, electric heat, chlorinated water, and industrial soap. Hanoi smelled like wood smoke, sewage running in open ditches, diesel fumes from antiquated trucks, and the sweet rot of tropical decay. Fort Lewis had sounded like humming machinery, traffic on paved roads, and jets overhead. Hanoi sounded like bicycle bells, shouting vendors, roosters, and the occasional backfire from Soviet-era vehicles. Fort Lewis had felt like controlled temperature, dry air, smooth concrete. Hanoi felt like oppressive humidity, mud underfoot, and the stick of sweat that never dried in tropical heat. The prisoners stepped onto the tarmac and into a world that felt medieval compared to the one they were leaving. The processing began immediately. Photographs, identification verification, preliminary interrogation. The officials asked about treatment in American captivity, about information provided to interrogators, about political reliability. The returnees would undergo weeks of political re-education before being allowed to resume normal life. Nguyen's interrogation lasted 3 hours. The political officer asked detailed questions about the American compound, the guards, the work assignments. Nguyen answered truthfully about structure and routine, but omitted the abundance, the waste, and the prosperity. He described adequate food, basic housing, and humane treatment. He did not mention supermarkets, automobiles, or moon landings. The interrogator seemed satisfied. Reunion with family came 2 weeks later. Nguyen's mother and younger brother traveled from their village, a journey that took 3 days by bicycle and ox cart. They arrived thin, worn, and exhausted. His mother wept at seeing him alive and healthy. She asked if the Americans had starved him. He assured her he had been adequately fed. The reunion was bittersweet. Nguyen's father had died during the war, killed by illness that could have been treated with antibiotics. His younger sister had married a soldier who had not returned. His village had suffered under bombing and deprivation. His family's house looked exactly as he remembered. Nothing had improved. Nothing had changed. That night, lying on a sleeping mat in his family's house, Nguyen stared at the darkness and remembered electric lights that burned all night in America. He heard his brother coughing and remembered the medical facility at Fort Lewis. He felt hunger and remembered cafeterias with unlimited food. The contrast was unbearable. The political re-education program lasted 3 months. Daily lectures on communist ideology, Vietnamese history, and the righteousness of the liberation struggle. The prisoners were expected to embrace these teachings and demonstrate ideological renewal. Tran Minh Duc refused to cooperate. In group sessions, he challenged the instructors with questions that revealed his American education. If capitalism was exploitative, why were American workers prosperous? If communism was superior, why was Vietnam poor? The instructors labeled him a traitor and moved him to solitary confinement. Other prisoners learned to keep silent. Nguyen played the game successfully. He attended lectures, repeated slogans, and demonstrated acceptable ideology. Inside, he held on to what he had learned. The instructors could not see his thoughts. They could not erase his memories. He would return to his village, resume farming, and keep his knowledge hidden. Perhaps someday it would matter, perhaps not. But he would remember truth even if he could never speak it. Release came in June 1973. The former prisoners dispersed to their home villages, carrying documentation that verified their re-education. They returned to communities that had suffered through years of war and loss. They resumed interrupted lives, and they kept silent about what they had witnessed in America. The years that followed tested their silence. North Vietnam's victory in April 1975 brought unification and communist control. The promised prosperity never materialized. Instead, economic collectivization, political repression, and continued poverty. The gap between revolutionary promises and economic reality grew wider. Those who had witnessed American abundance understood why. Communism could not create prosperity because it destroyed the incentives that generated productivity. By the 1980s, Vietnam's economic crisis had become undeniable. Industrial production declined, agricultural output stagnated, inflation destroyed currency value, famine threatened. The Communist Party faced a choice between ideological purity and economic survival. Doi Moi, the renovation policy announced in 1986, represented Vietnam's admission that communist economics had failed. The reforms introduced market mechanisms, private property rights, foreign investment, and economic freedom. The changes echoed what the prisoners had observed in America 20 years earlier. Freedom creates prosperity. Nguyen Van Thuan watched the reforms with quiet satisfaction. The changes came too late for his generation, but would benefit his descendants. He never spoke publicly about his time in America, but privately he explained to his children that the reforms were necessary. They asked how he knew this. He smiled and said he had observed it during the war. The transformation of Vietnam over the following decades vindicated everything the prisoners had learned. Market reforms generated economic growth. Foreign investment created jobs. Private enterprise produced goods that state companies never could. Living standards rose steadily. By 2010, Vietnam had become a middle-income country with growing cities and increasing prosperity. In 2015, Nguyen Van Thuan returned to America as a tourist, bringing his grandchildren to see Disneyland. They flew on Vietnam Airlines. At San Francisco International Airport, surrounded by Vietnamese tourists shopping at American stores, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. First as a prisoner convinced of American evil, then as a witness to American abundance, and finally as a free citizen of a Vietnam that had quietly learned the lessons he had carried home in secret. The supermarket in San Jose looked much like the one in Tacoma where he had first witnessed impossible plenty 48 years earlier. His grandchildren wandered the aisles, unimpressed by abundance that seemed normal to their generation. They had grown up with supermarkets in Ho Chi Minh City. The prosperity their grandfather had once thought impossible was becoming ordinary. That evening, Nguyen told his grandchildren about his captivity. He described the journey to America, the shock of abundance, and the transformation it caused. They listened politely, but struggled to understand. Vietnam and America were trading partners now. The enmity their grandfather described seemed ancient history. Nguyen realized his story had become obsolete. The victory he had witnessed through prison compound fences had been so complete that the conflict itself seemed pointless in retrospect. Vietnam had fought to preserve communism. It had won the war and lost the argument. The communists still ruled politically, but economically, Vietnam was becoming what it had fought against. The reunion occurred in 2018 at a hotel in Hanoi. 23 survivors of the Fort Lewis compound gathered to share experiences they had kept silent for decades. Tran Minh Duc had died in re-education camp in 1974. Levan Khai attended with his sons, successful businessmen in Ho Chi Minh City. Others came from across Vietnam and from America. They spent 3 days sharing stories and reflecting on what they had witnessed. They agreed on fundamentals. America had not defeated them with propaganda or torture, but with reality. The abundance was real. The freedom worked. The prosperity was sustainable. And Vietnam's path to development required adopting principles they had observed as prisoners 50 years earlier. On the final evening, Levan Khai proposed a toast. To our captors, who taught us more than they knew. To Tran Minh Duc, who died for truth. To Vietnam, which learned eventually. And to America, whose greatest victory was making enemies into students. Nguyen Van Thuan died in 2020 at age 75. His obituary mentioned his service in the liberation forces and his capture by American forces. It said nothing about his transformation or his silent advocacy for market reforms. His children knew the full story. He had seen prosperity and understood how to create it. The knowledge had been useless for decades but ultimately proved correct. The story of Vietnamese prisoners in America remains largely unknown. Exact numbers are unclear. Likely fewer than 200 prisoners were held in the continental United States during the war. Most returned to Vietnam and kept silent. Some defected or immigrated later. A few spoke to historians in their final years. Yet the pattern matches the German experience perfectly. Exposure to American abundance destroyed ideological certainty. Observation of democratic capitalism revealed truths that propaganda could not overcome. Prisoners who arrived as true believers departed as witnesses to prosperity they could not deny. The Vietnamese prisoners witnessed America at a crucial moment. 1967 to 1973 was a period of turmoil, but also unprecedented prosperity. The American economy was the largest in history. Consumer culture had reached its peak. Technology was advancing rapidly. The contrast was so extreme that no propaganda could bridge the gap. What the prisoners could not know in 1973 was that history would vindicate their observations. Vietnam would eventually adopt market economics. The prosperity they had witnessed in America would become the model for Vietnam's development. The transformation would take 40 years, but it would come. In the end, the war had been won by North Vietnam militarily, but lost philosophically. The communist victory of 1975 proved hollow when economic reality forced market reforms in 1986. Democratic capitalism survived and thrived. Communist economics collapsed even in nations that won communist revolutions. The prisoners had witnessed this outcome decades before it occurred. Nguyen Van Thuan's final words to his grandson, spoken weeks before his death, captured the essence of his journey. "I went to America expecting to die and discovered truth instead. The Americans did not defeat me with weapons, they defeated me with abundance. I returned to Vietnam and kept silent for 40 years, because truth that contradicts power is dangerous. But truth cannot be destroyed, it waits. Vietnam waited 40 years to learn what I saw in 1968. Prosperity comes from freedom. Remember this." The grandson remembered. Vietnam remembered. And in remembering, Vietnam became what Nguyen had seen through a chain-link fence in 1968. Today, Vietnamese workers assemble American iPhones. Vietnamese programmers code for Silicon Valley firms. Vietnamese students attend American universities on scholarships. The war that killed 3 million people ended with the losing side teaching the winning side how to win the peace. Nguyen Van Thuan's journey came full circle. He was captured trying to kill Americans. He died in a Vietnam that partnered with America. The weapon that defeated him wasn't bullets or bombs, it was the simple, overwhelming evidence that freedom works. His grandchildren don't understand what he witnessed because they live in the world his knowledge helped create. The supermarkets that shocked him are normal to them. The prosperity that seemed impossible is their baseline reality. His story is obsolete because his truth won. That's the real victory. Not changing governments, but changing minds. Not conquering territory, but converting ideology. The prisoners who returned to Vietnam in 1973 carried time bombs of truth that took 40 years to detonate. When they did, they remade a nation. Nguyen's final words weren't prophecy, they were patience. Truth waits. And truth, in the end, always wins. And here's the thing, this story, it's been hidden for 50 years. The Vietnamese government didn't want it told. American officials barely documented it. These prisoners went to their graves mostly silent about what they witnessed. But their grandchildren are starting to talk. Archives are opening. Testimony is emerging. We're uncovering more of these hidden transformations every month. Stories where ideology met reality, and reality won. Nguyen Van Thuan died believing his story didn't matter anymore. He was wrong. His grandchildren are finally talking. Archives are opening. The truth is coming out. Subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover next. North Korean pilots who defected and discovered everything they'd been taught was backwards. Like this video if hidden Cold War transformations blow your mind as much as they blow ours.